Welcome to the Resolution Room with me, Mike Gaston. The Resolution Room is a monthly podcast on behalf of Mediation Northern Ireland and Ulster University, where we explore the uses of mediation in conflict resolution and peacebuilding. This episode is on learning from practice, mainly in peacebuilding. And in this episode, we'll talk about how relationship is key to both conflict and conflict resolution. Why parties to conflict seldom know what they don't know about the dynamics of the situation they're in and why it is so important that they do. And how important respect, integrity, non-violence and courage are to conflict resolution and peacebuilding. To help us do that, I'm joined by Laurie Randall, Mediation and Development Director at Mediation Northern Ireland, and Seán Baoill, Mediator, Trainer and Peacebuilder. Laurie and Seán, you're both very, very welcome to the Resolution Room. In talking to the two of you, I'm very aware that you're two of the most experienced mediators, trainers and peacebuilders here in Northern Ireland and much further afield. And what I'd like to do and what I'd like to find out is, what was it that first attracted you to mediation? Laurie?
Yeah, so I was doing my master's in peace and conflict. So I'd always wanted to work into this sector. Having been born in 1968, so the Troubles was really my motivator. But I was doing that academic route, and then I attended a workshop at Corrymeela Summerfest, and Brendan McAllister and Joe Campbell were giving this workshop on mediation, and it suddenly gave me a practical tool because I was learning and understanding what was needed, but I didn't know how do you make a difference. And this gave me the route in.
And at that time, Brendan and Joe were what?
So director was, Brendan was the first director here. And then I think Joe was training lead at that point, though eventually he was assistant director. But way back when, because this is, more than 30 years ago now, or about 30 years, yeah.
And both massively inspirational speakers, leaders, and so committed to mediation to peacebuilding.
Yeah. And so, I've definitely been formed by their practice. Mm-hmm. It was brilliant.
Great. Seán, what about you? What attracted you to this line of work?
Well, I suppose the similarity with Laurie is that also born in 1968, but one of the big differences, I was born into a Irish Catholic Nationalist Republican family, very interested in non-violence. My father was in prison in 1971 for protesting against internment as a non-violent protest. I also was partly formed by experiences in Corrymeela in the 1980s and the Summerfests of that time, and went on to do my thesis at university as a community youth worker was on the viability of nonviolent action, and moved into Youth for Peace and the Peace People, and was aware of the work of Mediation Northern Ireland beside me, if you like, in the 1990s, while I was working with other peace and reconciliation organisations like Kilcranny and Corrymeela and the Peace People, and eventually moved to working with Mediation Northern Ireland at the end of the 90s into the early 2000s around issues around parading, particularly with the Parades Commission. So I suppose following the ceasefires 94, the Good Friday Agreement 98, getting involved in what was the most pressing conflict problem.
Both influenced by the Troubles here in Northern Ireland, and both having done formal education in related fields to peacebuilding and mediation.
Exactly.
How useful were your formal studies, Seán?
I suppose the formal studies weren't as directly applicable. At the time in universities, most courses avoided talking directly about the conflict we were in. It was one of the pushbacks from myself at the time of doing youth work. I went on to do a postgrad in peace studies in Magee and was slightly alarmed that they didn't want to talk about the Troubles in Northern Ireland. They also didn't want to talk about non-violence, about peace building. They were much more interested in studying the dynamics of war and conflict. So it was much more on the ground learning in practice rather than the theoretical constructs. We obviously studied all the big peace theorists like Johan Galtung, etc., but it was actually working in practice in peace building organisations where I did most of my learning.
That's where you got your learning. Laurie, what about you? How useful were your formal studies, your university studies?
So my first degree was peace studies over in Bradford, and so we were looking at nonviolence and different ways of understanding society and the theorists as well. I loved it. I got loads out of it. The bit that was a disappointment was the bit on Northern Ireland, because I was expecting to get this like really advanced insight into what was going on here, but because it was in an English context where most of my colleagues on the course, it was new for them. Like, we were being taught who the RUC were and things like that, and I was like, oh, right, I thought this was going to be university level rather than absolute basics. Although I still got to do my dissertation was on Northern Ireland, and I had really good support from Tom Woodhouse doing that. So there were people there, and James Connolly was the professor. There were some really good thinkers there, but like Seán, I think I then really learnt by doing. And one of the things about the way Mediation Northern Ireland worked was you were paired up with. So like when I first came in as a volunteer with Mediation Northern Ireland, I was observing the work they were doing on community awareness for the police in Garnival. And the person I was observing was John Lederack, John Paul Lederach's daddy. And I went from observing him to getting to co-work with him. So the formation was through being mentored and working on the ground and having these amazing folk working with you. And you had to watch what they were doing, but also they would give feedback on what I was doing. So really, learning by doing.
And just to contextualise that, John Paul Lederach, one of the leading writers and trainers in the field of mediation, The Moral Imagination, absolutely amazing book. And so lucky to have been involved with both John Paul Lederach and his father, John Lederach. So lovely opportunities.
Yeah, so John and Naomi Lederach were volunteers as Mennonites with Mediation Northern Ireland for, I think, over a year in the early days.
Absolutely amazing experience. But interestingly, that both of you have learnt more from your practice than you did through your formal education. I guess that's true of all of us, and no matter what field we've been in. You both spent substantial amounts of time working with Mediation Northern Ireland. How much has Mediation Northern Ireland changed since those early days?
Well, a lot. So when I began working here, it was, pre-ceasefires. There was a risk physically to the work we were doing. At various points, that meant, having to be really very careful about safety, even in the office as well. So there was that background was there. I think it had an impact on the working culture as well. Brendan used to bring a sleeping bag, because there was that sense of people were dying. Well, people were dying, and you really knew the value of your work. And if you were getting it wrong, actually, it had a really big consequence on the ground. Obviously, at the same time, there was also a lot of funding available. So we had core funding at the time. There was support coming from America on work we were doing. It was so pioneering as well. So we were having to do everything for the first time and really showcase that mediation was a credible tool to use for really difficult situations, like the things that were happening at the interfaces or on parades or on policing. So we were really trying to demonstrate actually this has something to offer. So it was very much in that pioneering kind of mode, I suppose, at that point. I've seen it go through then the ups and downs of just the changing context, meaning that the support for our work really changed and the nature of our work changed. But I suppose the last thing maybe to say around that is just recognising that we took a very different arc. A lot of other places where mediation arrives, it arrives for workplace or neighbour or family, and then might eventually grow to systemic level. Here it went the other way in that we began on that macro societal level conflict. And over time, I've seen us being able to give much more time into things like workplace conflict, which is still really relevant to peacebuilding, I would contend, because those are people living here as well. And, and we see as well the impact of the trauma of the conflict actually showing up in all walks of life. So all of those things are really, melded together. But yeah, Northern Ireland, we look very different now. And, what we offer is, I think, hugely different than it was then as well. There's a richness to it, I think.
Yes, a pre-Good Friday Agreement, very challenging times, very difficult situations, great learning though.
Yeah.
So, Seán, just looking at that, what were the key places that you first worked in pre-Good Friday Agreement?
Well, in terms of Mediation Northern Ireland, I started just after the Good Friday Agreement. So the work I was doing in Peacebuilding was with other organisations before the Good Friday Agreement. So just after the Good Friday Agreement, when I was doing Mediation Northern Ireland work, we were noticing that the work here was on the surrogate conflicts, the ones that have replaced the violent conflict of the Troubles. The war had ended and we were not clear who had won. So a lot of surrogate conflicts had kicked off. If we've won, we can still parade down this street, versus if we've won, they can't parade down our street anymore. If we've won, then we'll have access to the police. That kind of conflict were the ones we were talking about, whether it was flags, bonfires, interface violence. So from my early days, which were the very late 90s and early 2000s, we were dealing with those conflicts which were left unresolved by the Good Friday Agreement. So early work included police training, as the police were changing from the RUC to the PSNI. A lot around parades. I particularly worked in North and West Belfast and parading conflicts around there. And in the early 2000s, we started doing interface monitoring as well, as violence was still taking place, particularly at weekends and night times, between communities who were cheek by jowl with each other with a wall between the two. So my early work in Mediation Northern Ireland was in dealing with those kinds of conflicts. It was no longer the direct conflict of the IRA, the UVF, the UDA, the British Army, the police. It was inter-community, intra-community and interagency as well, those kind of conflicts that were left unresolved by the Good Friday Agreement.
So we've got a peace process, but we're not really engaging with it. What did we do next to make that happen?
Yeah. I suppose one of the things as a society, as people try to resolve what is the outworking of the Good Friday Agreement, is this still our country? Do we still belong here? We had communities with violence between them who would have asked Mediation Northern Ireland, could they help? Part of the reason Mediation Northern Ireland got asked was because we had spent the time building the relationships. So a lot of the early members of the Northern Ireland Conflict Mediation Association in 1986 eventually became the Mediation Network for Northern Ireland, eventually became Mediation Northern Ireland. They had come in because they had already been working with armed groups, whether the police, the army, paramilitary organisations. You had Mary Montague, who had worked with prisoners, who then became one of the directors of Tides Training. You had Brendan McAllister, who had worked in the probation service. You had a lot of people who had already connected with these organisations. And for me, importantly, they had built relationships of trust, walking alongside without being part of. And as Brendan and Joe talked about, there was something of the smell of the other. So when they met with Republicans, loyalists wanted to know, what were they like? After having met with the loyalists, the Republicans wanted to know, what have they got to say? Do you really believe them? So bringing the sense of the other became important, to walk alongside people and yet to be an other that people could trust and had a relationship with. And for me, I suppose one of the big things I've learned, both from the peace building and the ongoing work of mediation, is that primacy of relationship. It's you don't start off with, we have business to do. You start off with, I'm Seán, you're Mike, tell me about you. What's it like to be you? Let me tell you about me. And really get to know each other at a human level. This isn't sort of subterfuge or counterfeit. This is real, genuine interest in the other person. And working from that, then being able to drop down to people's feelings, people's needs, people's core values. And that's where we choose to work from. it's there in the practice of mediation, but it's also there in the practice of peace building.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that. So the phrase we would have used was critical friend. And in order to be that critical friend, so there's you got the friend bit, the connection, but also that ability to not just be someone's ally. In fact, to be a mediator, you're needing to be able to also support the clarity of what is the situation, what are the options, what are the potential outcomes of those. And that requires a level of independence for us as an organisation to be able to stand on our own 2 feet and not be owned by anyone. And that can be a real challenge, particularly if you're doing work with big organisations that like to think you now work for them. Because, they're thinking, well, we're paying you, therefore you work for us now. And you're like, no, we work with you. Whether or not you're paying us, you don't own us. And that's really essential for that mediative approach.
Absolutely vital. And of course, one of the important things in the mediative and peace-building process is how people are when they come to you seeking help to resolve a conflict. Where are people? Where did you find people in their own places when they came to you? What was their state of mind? What was their state of being?
I think, interestingly, Seán said a wee bit about how people began, where there was that curiosity about each other. Yeah. But actually, in the later work with them, I would have found community representatives actually very sophisticated and courageous. A lot of folk who had been engaged and were kind of community activists had actually gone on quite a learning journey themselves. They'd learnt about principled negotiation. They'd had a lot of experience of handling issues within, from a community development approach within their own communities, and we're glad of our help in holding a process, but they were very cautious about being manipulated and allergic to anything that felt like it was, trying to push them in any particular direction.
So how easy was it for them to accept you as a critical friend?
Mm. I think it helped that Seán and I were working together on a lot of that stuff. So that was, I suppose, because we were working across what we would term an ethnic frontier, coming as a Republican and a Unionist was actually really important, particularly for getting in the door, that those communities could recognise who was coming as either, having at least some sense of what does it mean to be in this community. And I think also then, so that maybe gets you in the door, but then what happens next is how do they find you? And you'll definitely get tested at the beginning. You're very much looking to see, and even little things like in those early days, this might seem really normal now, but like in those early days, the fact that you would give people your mobile phone number, that you weren't just a Monday to Friday 9 to 5 kind of person, that you were available to them when they needed it, that you were willing to stand out in the rain with them during events happening, even if there was nothing else you were doing other than accompanying and witnessing. That's the kind of thing I think that earned people's trust, that actually, you really are sticking to your word and you're showing up with us.
And Seán, how hard was it for you to persuade people that you really were meeting them where they were, not where you were coming from?
It was hard, but it was the additional work beyond the mediation work that made that possible. So if we think of something like the Ardoyne Shopfronts, which myself and Laurie mediated for 10 years, I had previously trained the main members of each side, on the Republican and Loyalist side, in principal negotiation skills as part of the Workers' Educational Association, which is no longer with us. But that training gave them the language and gave them the models and the paradigms to understand the conflict they were in. And it was because of that there was sufficient relationship for them to then take the risk. The term mediation was fairly new at the time, and people didn't quite know what it meant back in the 80s and 90s. By the time we're into the 2000s, people were becoming more au fait with the term mediation. Unfortunately, there was some fairly poor practice out there under the guise of mediation, where people would occasionally try to resolve things from a top-down perspective of, I'm a well-known celebrity, politician, church leader, and I've talked to both sides, and sign here, this is the best deal you're going to get. We had to do a lot of undoing of that poor quality work. going, as you say, meeting people where they're at, starting with who they are, what they actually need, what their communities need, and not coming with a solution. Part of the practice of mediation is we don't come with a solution, we don't come with a decision. We come alongside and say, what do you need? And how can those needs be mutually met by both sides? That it takes a long time. We were joking about, there's a meme that's very popular on the internet at the moment, saying you can be right or you can be in a relationship. It comes from Terence Real, who's a couples counsellor. And it's wise in the sense of, for couples who are in deep conflict with each other, constantly trying to be right destroys the relationship. However, it's not entirely true, because actually you can be right and be in a relationship, but it takes a lot of resources, a lot of time, a lot of energy, and as Laurie was saying, a willingness to step outside the Monday to Friday 9 to 5, and also step outside the role that we normally see as the professional role, as if I am not a human being, I'm not affected. We allow ourselves to be fully affected, fully connected, and in relationship. When I think of the practice of people like Brent McAllister, who's no longer with us, or Alan Ruddock, who has retired from the field, I spent years trying to get them to write down, what did you learn? What can you tell us about peace building in this field? And Brent just about got the words drawn out of him by Geoffrey Corrie into a book. Alan never did. But one of the things I noticed about their practice was the maintenance of long-term relationship. In a piece of work with Alan in South Down, the South Down Intercommunity Dialogue Project, he kept in touch with a senior loyalist whose daughter had a profound disability. He kept in touch with a senior Republican in the area whose wife was suffering a long-term disease. And every week for about 4 or 5 years, he checked in on them. How's your daughter? How's your wife? How's your daughter? How's your wife? So that years later, when the ceasefires were in danger, when you had to call people into a room and talk about, are the IRA and are the UDA going to maintain ceasefire? Are they not? You call them into the room and say, I need you here. When? About an hour from now in Belfast. They would literally drop everything and say, this is the guy who calls me every week to check my daughter. This is the guy who calls me every week to check my wife. That maintenance of relationship without any hope of transaction, of payback. I honestly care about you and I will be there for you even when I don't need you. That's what made it possible to have the conversations which were so crucial throughout the 2000s.
I mean, that long-term relationship is a very important key, and it's very often one that we haven't got the time for, or we don't have the funding for, exactly. and that's been an issue too. What I'm hearing here, though, is that we need to apply a lot of perseverance, hard work, courage. Laurie, what else do we need to apply to the process of peace building?
I know, I'm smiling. There's a new bunch of mediators being trained, and as we arrived into the building this morning, they're just in for their first session. And I know one of the things I will say to people coming new to this work is that actually you need to be working from a place of compassion. And so I'm going to say love. If you actually don't love people, they will notice, they will feel it. You can't fake it. You actually do need to care. And so we talk about being multi-partial, actually caring about the results for all those people who are in the room for that mediation, for that peace building, but also for the communities they're representing, for other people who will be affected by it. You need to bring the fullness of that. Now, and then not get lost into it. It's not a sentimental kind of love, but it is a deep caring.
You've used the word multi-partiality, which is a very complex idea. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So when I was first trained as a mediator, there was, and there would still be, the language out there internationally, the language of being the neutral third party. We already knew right from the beginning in Mediation Northern Ireland that's not really possible. If you're born in this country, you're formed in one community or the other. So even if you are not choosing to act in a way that's bigoted or you're still going to only know what you know. So then we used the phrase of being sorry, I've lost my language now.
Not impartial.
Impartial, thank you. Yes. So we talked about being impartial, and that was the idea of you do need to know yourself, you need to know your own background, but you choose to act impartially. So this kind of professional idea, and that sort of made sense for a number of years, and then eventually I rebelled against that as well, because it sounded like a degree of distance or coldness that just wasn't true for my practice. You know, I was born here. I had my children were growing up here. You know, it just wasn't true. So that's why I started using multi-partial, and that sense of that you actually do care, but you care for all. You're not there with an agenda that you're pushing on one or the other. But you know, you're caring about the outcome. Though even naming agenda, we did need to be clear. We actually do have a peacebuilding agenda, and we're being upfront about that. You know, and I'd be very upfront with folk about being a pacifist, and caring about that very active role of non-violence, of bringing a new way of challenging the current order and allowing something new to grow. So I am at that, for sure.
I'm going to put you both on the spot in a second. But first of all, I just want to remind both of us, you and I, Laurie, that one of the key things you taught me was trust the process.
Yeah, that'll be one of the key phrases.
Why is that so important?
Partly because you'll be really scared when the mess explodes in the middle of the process, and being able to remind yourself as a practitioner, that's okay. This is the stage we're at. It is going to get messier before it gets tidy. So I think it helps the courage that you need as a practitioner, and actually just really knowing this process that we use when we are mediating has been really hard tested. So I think that's harder to believe at the beginning, but when you've had decades of experience, you've seen that actually it can bring something creative to even the worst situations.
And Seán, for you, trusting the process, how hard is that? How hard was it in the early stages?
To be honest, it still remains somewhat of a challenge. And we have learnt the knowledge, the skills, the practices. The analogy we sometimes use is that kitchen drawer, the second, third drawer down in your kitchen, it is full of junk. If you want to clear it out, you're going to have to tip it out. When you do, it's going to make an awful mess, and it's very easy to despair. If you know the practices, if you know the skills, you know the knowledge, it's do it one broken felt tip pen at a time, and really get into what you're doing and go beyond the sort of the corporate slogans kind of values to really mean it. So Laurie's right, talked about multi-partiality is genuinely caring about both sides. Non-violence isn't just anti-violence, it's creating a positive peace. Integrity includes us holding each other to account, holding our feet to the fire. And in one particular piece of work where I was facilitating between Loyalists and Republicans, Laurie challenged me that I was a little faster with Republicans to shut them down when they broke the ground rules. So we all agreed the ground rules, we put them up there about respect, and we really mean it. And when people start using very aggressive language, I shut them both down. But I shut the Republicans faster. And the reason I shut the Republicans faster deep down is because I'm a bigot. I grew up believing that Loyalists were kind of mindless thugs. Therefore, when they act that way, they get a half a second longer. But when the Republicans do it, I go, lads, you're letting the family down here. You got to behave yourself. That's because I'm a bigot. I hated hearing it. And I absolutely needed somebody who was watching the nuance and the detail and was saying, you're a bit faster than the Republicans.
So, Seán, are we all bigots?
I'm afraid we are. We cannot. We can't escape where we came from, what we came from, our core values, our core beliefs. They form us. We're sometimes unaware of the water we swim in, and the assumptions that we've grown up with all our lives, whether watching Hollywood movies, TV shows, is the heroic, powerful, usually white male will go in and beat up the bad guys and restore peace and justice. It's nonsense. But it's a nonsense that's so drilled into us that we sometimes find it hard to resist the urge to be that hero. We need to drop back down to what is the nature of our relationship? How are we going to work together? What is it that I don't yet know? Where it's impossible to know what you don't know. So how do you become aware of your unconscious bias? You work in a relationship with co-workers who have the courage to hold your feet to the fire and say, that landed wrong.
That's very interesting, because one of the problems for me in the early days of peacebuilding was that we were all just too nice. And we didn't recognise our own bigotry.
Absolutely.
And we didn't challenge our own bigotry. And it's great to hear that from you, Seán. I'm going to hold your feet to the fire one more time.
Do that, yeah.
And I'm going to say to you, what do you know now about peacebuilding mediation that you didn't know 25 years ago?
So
And that you wish you knew it.
The problem is I think I still don't know. It's that bit where I think I'm there. I think I understand now. And I suppose what I know now is that that's a dangerous thought. I think one of the most dangerous and pervasive ideas that we grow up with is when I have more information, I will understand better. When I understand better, I'll be wise. And the more information you accumulate, the more you think that you understand. I hope that I'm coming to realize that actually information isn't the same as understanding. The more sure you are that someone else is wrong, the more you have failed to understand something. And when we're in pain, when we're hurt, and most of the people who come to us are in pain and hurting, when they do come to us with pain and hurt, the last thing they want to do is get into a relationship. And yet it's down and through that the solution is. So remembering to sit calmly as the person in front of you is in tears or is raging or is threatening, and calming yourself so that you can stay in contact with them, be the person who is really listening to for once, and who's reassuring them that they have the way out of this themselves.
So there's a real element of time in this. There's a real element of don't rush the process.
Yeah, and it can be difficult in a professional field where, whoever's paying for the mediation has a limit of how much they would like to pay. They usually want it done as quickly and as cheaply as possible. I sort of use the disparaging phrase, dirty deals done cheap. And we're saying mediation is not a dirty deal done cheap. It takes the time to really connect with a person, their feelings, their needs, how come they've got themselves stuck, including the embarrassment of nobody wants to be stuck. The fact that they come for mediation themselves is a recognition that they know they don't hold the solution entirely themselves. It's not about them imposing their view. It's about working with the person they're in conflict with to find a way through.
Recognising that we're in the final stages of this conversation. And it's a pity because we could talk for double the time. Laurie, I'm going to hold your feet to the fire too. And I'm going to ask you to tell us what was your single biggest principle. If you had one principle to pass on to future mediators, future peace builders, what would that be?
I think the core for me that I name everywhere, I suppose, is integrity. So actually really being authentic and being consistent in what you're at. So it's not the opposite maybe of the dirty deal done cheap, is the integrity of the work. And I think that there will be there will be a difference in the quality of what happens if that's your foundation. I'm still learning that, of course, myself. I think that some of the work we did around mindfulness gave me a chance to learn more about who I was. All the mistakes I've made around conflict, I'm still learning. So maybe I'm stealing too then. So integrity, so whatever your rock is, that being there, that solidness, but maybe the always learning can be layered on top of that, Mike, if I'm allowed.
I am absolutely delighted you gave us both of those, Laurie. It's been, I can't believe how fast the clock ran round here, by the way. We've run out of time, sadly, but and that brings us to the end of this edition of the resolution.
Thank you.
Room. But many, many thanks, Laurie Randall, Mediation Development Director at Mediation Northern Ireland. Many, many thanks, Seán Baoill, mediator, trainer and peace builder. The learnings today have been immense. Thank you both very much for that. Now, if you're listening to this and you'd like to find out more about mediation, or if there's a conflict that you're aware of and would like to have resolved, contact Mediation Northern Ireland at www.mediationnorthernireland.org. Thanks for listening. We look forward to your company in the resolution for the next edition of this podcast series.
Thank you.